Endgames. Why are they so difficult? In the last stage of the game, the players are usually already quite tired and also low on time, which makes it quite difficult to analyze positions as deeply as you can in the opening and middle game. Also, once the amount of pieces gets reduced, things become quite a bit more concrete, and the accurate calculation of variations becomes much more important, as often every single tempo matters. So this was a game played by Quang Liem from Vietnam, and also Alexander Donchenko, who is having quite a good World Cup, from Germany. So the opening was not exactly very interesting. We had a symmetrical Grünfeld. Both sides finished their development without many problems, and after knight e4, the position is completely symmetrical, though it is white to move, but this is not enough to give white any advantage, and now a lot of pieces were traded off. Rook c1, rook c8, knight e4, bishop e4, and we get this position. The pawn was attacked, and here, even though black has split pawns, he has doubled pawns here and a somewhat weak pawn here, he is fine because his pawns are on light squares, which means his bishop is more active than this one. And also these pawns can at any point be traded, and also he has the more active queen. So white didn't really get much from the opening, and now rook d8, rook d2, and h5. So Donchenko finds this nice plan to exchange the bishops with bishop h6, because once this bishop is gone, this pawn will become a bit more weak. So black doesn't really have a way to put pressure on this pawn. So h5, also hinting at h4 at some point. If the pawn goes to h3, there might be some problems with the king or the h2 pawn in the long term. So h4 is played, king h7, b3, king, bishop h6. The bishops are exchanged, and queen c1. So here white could kind of play e3, but then there would be some problems on the d file after c5. There is no real threat here, but the threat is the move e5. For example, if white doesn't do anything, king g2, e5, now the spin is too strong and there's too many attackers on this d4 square, so now black will win a pawn, as the pawn can't take anything because of the hanging rook on d2. So there would be some problems with the natural move e3. So queen c1 is played. Now there is a threat of rook c2 with a discover check, taking the pawn on c6. King g7, rook c2, queen d4, and king g2. So here black has emerged with a pawn up, though the pawn is doubled on the e file. So this 5-on-4 majority is not very effective, at least for the moment, which means black's advantage is not that great. So here still white is the one defending, and there are certain positional principles that should be abided by, and one of them is that the defending side should try to exchange pawns as much as possible, because the less pawns are on the board, the closer we will get to some theoretical positions. For example, one pawn against 0 in a rook endgame is usually a draw if the king is in the right position. So we should basically try to liquidate this whole queen side and leave black with the 5-on-4 majority on the king side, because with these doubled pawns, black will not be able to create a passed pawn. So here white played king g2. Arguably, rook c6 was better to start exchanging pawns and to activate the rook as quickly as possible. Here, if black plays e3, which might have been something that white was scared of, the queen can simply take it, and after this, it's not even black who's playing for the win, because white is attacking the pawn on a7. And if these two pawns are left alive, white will have a big advantage with the connected passed pawns. So, not sure why white did not do this. Queen d1 might be played, and we might get a position similar to the one in the game, e3, rook a2, for example. And from here, there's only two pawns left on the queen side. This king is still far away, which means white should be in time to exchange these pawns and then leave black with the 5-on-4 majority, which will not be very effective on the king side, which should end in a safe draw. For example, b4, with the idea to play b5, b6, and exchange the pawns. If black attacks this pawn, we will attack this one. And for example, this would be a dead draw. Black could kind of play on with the eventual idea to play f4, but at this level it should be a very easy draw for white. So here white decided to kind of keep some tension and not exchange pawns. Queen d1 anyway, and now a4. So kind of trying to save the pawn on a2 after rook d2. But again, I think it's a very simple draw if white had taken here, rook d2, e3, as this pawn is actually more important, because if this pawn is taken, white will have to defend a 5-on-3 majority. For example, a4, rook e2, now the threat is e3. So for example, king f1, rook b2, and at the end of this, after some pawn exchanges, black's majority on the king side is quite a bit more dangerous, as black can, for example, play e3, exchanging these pawns, and he will be left with a clean 4-on-2 majority, which means he will be able to eventually create connected passed pawns. Apparently this is still a draw, but in practice this would be very, very unsafe. So I don't really like a4. Again, rook c6, rook d2, e3, rook a2, and again we get the same position, b4. Other moves work as well. The thing is that at any point white will attack this one, and he will try to exchange the pawns with b6. And black can't really avoid this. For example, again, if rook a4, b5, threatening b6 simply, and if black tries to do something fancy like a6, then after b7 still the black rook will be distracted from the a pawn, and the pawns will be exchanged, and again, easy draw. So instead a4 is played, but this keeps some tension on the board, which is not very good for the defending side. Rook d6, and now white is not allowed to exchange pawns anymore. And something like rook b1 would be a mistake, because now again this would allow white to exchange some pawns, and now black will be defending the pawn on a7, which will make it very difficult to activate the rook. So rook d6, and now the game goes on. Rook c4, f5, black is setting his big majority in motion. Rook b4, white is trying to activate the rook, king f7, rook b7, and rook d2. So the rook goes back to d2. Defending this pawn will not really work out. Here, for example, white could consider b4, but this would already create some problems for white, because now, after the exchanges, the king is actually very close compared to this one. And at this point, black is winning, because not only does he have an extra pawn, which would not generally be enough to win, but also he has the more active king. So two of these things is already enough to win. And now the rook can come behind the pawn, and the king will defend this one. So white will not be able to exchange these pawns. If he could, it would again be a draw. So defending the pawn is kind of possible, but after rook b6, the threat is to play rook a6, and it's not really possible to defend all of the pawns. So black's rook will likely be passive, or for example rook d2. This is also possible. Again, white should avoid giving up this pawn. Rook c2 is possible, rook a6, rook c5. And here black's rook is terribly passive, it's tied to two pawns. So here, even though black is a pawn ahead, he has the very passive rook, and white can try to improve the king. And this should be enough to draw, as the rook can basically not move. So a5 wasn't really possible, so rook d2 is the only way to try to play for a win. e3 by white, not giving up this pawn. Again, something like rook a7, rook e2, this is kind of playable. But now after rook c2 or rook b2, black will eventually play e3. After exchange, for example, after rook c3, exchanging the pawns, and black's majority on the king side will be quite dangerous. So perhaps this is not recommended. e3 instead, and now rook b2, and here again white should try to exchange all the pawns, and this was perhaps the last chance to do that, though at this point it's not that easy anymore, because black's king is in the game. So for example, rook a7, if black takes, at this point we can use, and we have to use, this pawn to our advantage. For example, rook a8, trying to push the pawn as far as possible. Again, if black just tries to push his pawn, then this should end in a draw, more or less. For example, rook a3, rook e6, rook c8, and again the pawns will be exchanged, as the white pawn will divert the rook. So instead, Here, black should probably activate the king, and white has enough counterplay with rook g8, but this move specifically must be found, and sure, the variations are quite difficult, but as they say in rook endgames, the first priority is to have an active rook. So for example, if king f6, then we can just push the pawn, and this would be enough to draw, because again, we will distract the rook and take this pawn, while the king is tied to this one. So black should play more actively, for example c5, rook g6, king d5, rook g5. So this pawn is going, but white has enough counterplay, and here rook f8. The rook must go behind the passed pawn, and now white has taken some pawns on the king side, which means he has ideas of playing g4, creating his own passed pawn, which will distract the rook again, and the king will also be able to come back into the game. So at this point white would even be a pawn up, but black's king is more active, so it should be more or less a draw. But of course this would require already white to look for quite concrete variations. So instead a5, this works as well. King e6, a6. So now whenever white takes this pawn, this one will become very dangerous. c5, and here king f1 is played, activating the king somewhat, but I think in such positions we should improve the king only if we are sure that we will be in time to go to some kind of important square. And here the king is quite far away from c1, and on e1, d1 and f1 it's not really doing that much. Instead, maybe again we should have tried to exchange pawns, though here black will not exchange all of the pawns. After king d6 and c4, I guess we would still have to improve the king. At this point the position is quite dangerous, but white's king will be in time, and black has only one passed pawn, which the king should be able to deal with, and one of black's pieces will always be tied to the defense of a8. So here king f1, king d6, king e1. So white is improving the king, it's c4, and this is the very important moment of the game. Here white had only one move to draw the game, and the rest of the moves are completely losing. So such are endgames. The margin for error is quite low, so we cannot just play on feelings most of the time and the general principles, though of course general principles do apply in endgames and they are useful. There is nothing better than concrete calculation. And here with 21 minutes, Quang Liem made a blunder in 2 minutes, b4, and of course it's easy to criticize once we're at home with computers, and also let's not forget the players do not know the concrete evaluation of the position when they are playing, so it is quite likely that Quang was thinking that it's already lost because of this passed pawn and this active king. But here white could try to make a draw with the move rook takes a7, which is natural enough, and the point is again to use this pawn as a distraction to pick up black's passed pawn. So for example here white would make a draw more or less without any effort, rook b7, and here after rook a2 white could just exchange, and if black does something else, for example king c6, and black can't really make progress as the king can't really go anywhere anyway. So for example, well, not king d1 but something like king f1, black can't really do anything. For example, if here then a7, and black will again have to use his rook to stop the pawn, and we will again get this 5-on-4 on the king side. So here after rook takes a7, perhaps c3 was what white did not like, and here again white has a narrow path to a draw with king d1, because the threat here was to give a check, rook b1, and after king e2 the only move, then c2, and then c1 queen. So this is the only way to stop it, king d1. So by process of elimination this could be found. And now again if rook b3, here king c2, black can pick up the pawn on f2, but now white's king is finally very active. And again either the king or the rook will have to deal with this passed pawn, more likely that it's the rook, after rook a8 for example, and a7. Black has a 5-on-3, but he cannot really create a passed pawn. This is because he has doubled pawns, and white has some counterplay with rook g8, picking up one pawn, more pawns as well, and also it's just hard to make progress with black here. So it's not clear what's the most critical line here. it could be rook takes f2, but again this is quite similar, rook a2, a7, and after this, rook c8, white is able to pick up the pawn on c3 and more or less make a draw. So b4 is played, and the problem with this move is that now this passed pawn becomes very difficult to stop, and one tempo was enough for black to win the game, and here this b4 pawn will not really be any use. So c3, so now the threat is to give a check and play c2. This is a common pattern in rook endgames when the pawn is defending the d2 square, so king d1 must be played. And here black is down to his last minute and he does not find the winning continuation, and of course, as happens in rook endgames, it is not easy to find them. So king c6 is played. So the most natural is probably to just bring the king, but this will not really bear anything. For example, here again the king will be distracted, the rook will be distracted by this pawn, and white can just start picking up these pawns, and black cannot really create a queen here, because if the pawn goes to c2, for example like this, then this king will not really be able to hide, though at this point it could go here. King d2 is more to the point, and now this king cannot hide from the checks at any point, and it cannot go to b2 to make a queen because it will always get checked, and this rook is tied to this pawn as well. So king d5 doesn't really work. So here the winning move is the move rook d2 check. Why it is winning, it's not entirely clear, but for example king e1, this is simple. Now after black moves the rook anywhere, d3 or d5, on the d file, now the king is cut off from the play, which means the rook will have to work to stop this passed pawn, and this is impossible. For example, rook b8 c2, it looks like the rook is behind the passed pawn, but now due to a simple tactic, black will be able to win the rook. So here white has to play king c1, and only now does black play king c6, and here this time what worked in the game for white will not work anymore. Rook a7, king b6, and here rook a7, king a6, and it turns out white's king is on a bad square and it is cut off from the game, and the black king can also march in through here. So this was winning for black, but it's not entirely obvious. Instead he goes king c6, rook a7, king b6, rook takes e7, king a6, and this is a draw because after rook c7 black loses his passed pawn. And now we get this position where again the material is now equal, and neither side has passed pawns. Well, white has this passed pawn, which may come in handy, and black has a lot of weaknesses to attack, but since his king is cut off, the g6 pawn is also quite weak. So at this point it should be a draw, but of course chess is very difficult. Also, both players at this point got added time, so after the 40th move, both sides got an extra half an hour, so now they can relax and try to think how to make the draw, or for black, how to make some kind of progress, as still it's black who is trying to win because of the numerous weaknesses. So king b6, the king comes closer, and king c5 is a nice move, stopping the king from going anywhere, and now black plays rook g2, attacking the pawn, rook e5. The idea is that if the pawn is taken, which it is, black could activate his king. But here, white activated his king in the wrong way. So here, with a lot of time on the clock, Quang Liem played king e2 basically instantly, and this shows how important it is to calculate concretely in endgames. It makes sense to go to e2 to try to guard this pawn on e3, but it turns out the king had to be active and go to d2, c3, d4 to try to help white in his pursuit of these pawns, as well as it will help white try to create counterplay with his own passed pawn. So king d2, and now for example if rook g2, the king can come out to c3, and the white is making a draw here because for example after king c4, rook e6, white's passed pawn will start to count, and black's king is not in a very good place. But after king e2, it turns out that the position is now winning for black, and how it is winning is that here, after this check, white's king cannot go up, as this pawn is dominating it, this pawn is in the way, and for example after king f1, now black is in time to attack this pawn, and the white king, whenever they try to take the pawn on g6, it will allow black's king to go up and pick up the pawn on b4. So here black will likely be left with two pawns. So king c6 is played instead, which is again a natural move, played quite quickly, but again the wrong move. And here for white to draw, he must find the move again, king d2, perfecting his mistake, but this is not really possible in human play. If we decide that the king should go to e2, it's very difficult to then go to d2, losing a tempo. But it turns out again, black doesn't have a way to make progress. For example, king d6, the rook can go to a5, and after rook g4, the king can again go to d4. If here, white can pick up one of the pawns, and even try to give a perpetual, for example, rook a5, king f6, now the king has been cut off from the passed pawn, and after b5, even though black is still two pawns ahead, it turns out that this pawn is strong enough to create quite serious counterplay. So this is not entirely obvious again, but it is what it is. King f2, now rook g4, and here white's idea is that this rook is kind of cut off from the game, which means even though it will take a pawn, it might not be able to come out. So this is quite a strange way to make a draw, but it might work. Rook c5 check, king d6, rook c4. So now what white has done is they have cut off this king from the passed pawn, which means the passed pawn will be quite strong. Though here, of course, the king would like to be on d4 at a more active place to at least help control some squares. Rook h4, rook g2, rook g4, king h2. So here, white's idea is that this rook cannot escape. For example, it can't go out through the g file or the h file, but black could win the game by a simple pawn break with f4. The idea is that if here, then after f3, this pawn endgame is actually winning, though again, this is not entirely obvious. For example, king g3, king d5, but it turns out that white is not in time to create any real counterplay, and at this point he is kind of in zugzwang. If b5, black will pick up this pawn. If e4, they will pick up this pawn, and they're in time. So white has to ruin his king's position and go to f2. And now, for example, after king c4, e4, black is in time to pick up the pawns. So here, white couldn't exchange rooks. If he doesn't, he will have to give up the pawn on b4. There are other ways to win as well. One of them is to take here and take on b4, though in this specific situation this would not work. Even though black has two connected passed pawns, concrete calculation is everything, and after rook g3, there is no one to defend this pawn. So the win was there, but black, after thinking for quite a while, played king d5. So here, out of his 15 minutes, he spent 13 and made a horrible blunder, and white did not capitalize and made his move instantly. So here, still white had a lot of time to make the draw, but he did not find it. Here, the draw was quite funny, but quite logical. After all, white has a passed pawn, and he can push it. And it turns out that even though the rook is hanging, black's rook is just stuck on the king side, behind all of his pawns, and he is simply not in time to bring his rook to pick up this pawn. Still, black can of course never lose this. For example, here, black would still kind of be playing for a win with his 4 connected passed pawns against the queen, but of course, such position should be a draw, especially if the alternatives all lose. So this was quite an amazing draw, but it's not that hard to calculate b5. The hard part is to consider b5, giving up a rook in one move. So here instead rook c5 is played, now king d6, rook c3, and now black gives some checks and plays f4 finally. So now the pawns are exchanged and black is up 2 pawns. They are connected passed pawns, which usually in rook endgames, if we're up 2 pawns, this should be enough to win more or less any endgame. But the game is still not over. b5, king d5, rook b3, king c4. Black is activating his king, rook b1. So now white's rook is behind the passed pawn, which is ideally placed, but black decides to exchange one pair of pawns and leave himself with 2 pawns. So he goes to pick up this pawn, king g3, rook b7, king f4, and rook takes b5, and white plays rook g1. So he wants to pick up this pawn instead of this one. For example, if here, then this would be quite an easy win. For example, king g5, let's say the king goes to e4, and now black has the 2 connected passed pawns, which means all endgames are going to be winning unless the pawns are blockaded, but here they cannot be blockaded. For example, rook g3 and h4, and the king can slowly come back to help his pawns. So instead, white decides to go rook g1 and pick up this pawn. After king g3, rook g3, king e2, white gives some checks to make black's king position worse. Black could go here, but now suddenly it is a draw, because there is a threat of rook to e3 trying to win this pawn. For example, if here rook d6 would make a draw. So at this point, it is actually a drawish endgame. So king e2, rook g2, and eventually the black king goes to f1. It's not the ideal square as it doesn't support the pawn, but black correctly assessed that this is winning, and black will give up this pawn to create this passed pawn. And usually with the h pawn, the endgames are drawn, but here, after rook b3, a very good and precise move, black is able to cut off this king horizontally, which means that this whole area of the board will not be accessible to this king. So after king takes h4, e4, now white's rook is the only one that can stop this pawn, which should not be enough. Rook f6 is played, king g2, rook g6, king f2, and here black's winning plan was to put the rook on g3. So this is obvious enough to stop the check, but what black likely missed is that after rook a6, black has only one move to win the game, which is rook f3. And the idea here is that after rook a2, black will block with the rook, and now the rook is attacked, so white has to lose a tempo, and the pawn will be able to queen. For example, if here, h3, and after a check, the king will go to f1. Because, for example, if here, then black will not be able to win, because he will have to lose the cutting off of the king to get his own king out of the corner. For example, if here, for something like rook h8, and if the king goes out, then again it's a check, and if the rook goes here, white will go to the f-file, and this king will never be able to escape. So this is a known theoretical draw. So instead, here rook f3 has to be played, and it turns out there is no one to stop this pawn. If white goes back to check here, then the king will go to f2. If white goes back here again, now h3 is possible, and black will block all checks, and the pawn will go to h2, and this king is too far away. But instead, after this check, here black's last chance to win the game was to go back to g2, and again play rook g3, but this is the only way to make the win, well, to win the game. But unfortunately king e2 was played, trying to hide from the checks behind this king, but now this king is too far away from his pawn, and he can now be attacked from behind. Rook a6 was played first. Now if h3, this would be a draw by more or less perpetual check, and for example here black can try to push his pawn with king g1, but after king g4, h2, it seems like black is about to win, but after rook a1, turns out this king cannot run away anywhere from this pawn because it requires defense. So here rook b4 is played, king f5, going towards the pawn, and in a very strange way this is a draw. h3, rook h6, the rook is behind the passed pawn, rook b3, king g4, and now the pawn is getting picked up. So this couldn't really be avoided. At this point, black doesn't really have a way to make progress. Again, if here there is a check, and if you go here, white can just continue checking, and the black king can't go anywhere. If it, for example, tries to go towards this rook, then white can just go here and pick up the pawn. So unfortunately, this endgame ended in a draw. After a lot of adventures, white was able to defend, black was not able to capitalize on his advantage. And even though all of these mistakes seem quite silly, of course, at the board, at such a tournament as the World Cup, it is extremely difficult to keep your nerves and try to play at your best. And even with having 3 pawns up at some point, black was not able to win. Though thankfully, in the later tie breaks, he was able to beat his opponent, Quang Liem, in the rapid games, and later he was knocked out by Nodirbek Yakubov in the next round. So still he went through in this round, but he could have won a bit more easily beforehand to not even have to play the tie breaks. So hopefully this was useful, and hopefully this encourages you to always think in your endgames and always calculate very concretely, as even though the position might look like it's a win or a draw, it's always very, very difficult.